The shovel blade bit into the damp earth with a sound like a heavy sigh. Elias put his weight onto the worn wooden step, his boot heel grinding against the steel. The soil was rich and black, clinging in thick clods. He levered the handle back, the muscles in his forearms and shoulders tightening into hard ropes, and tossed the first shovelful onto a growing pile. A few feet away, a lanky brown dog with intelligent amber eyes watched him, head cocked. The dog Barrow shifted his weight from one paw to the other, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump against the ground. It was late autumn, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of coming frost. The sun, already low in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows from the skeletal fingers of the oak trees. This was the spot. Not on the gentle rise behind the small house his parents had left him, where a root cellar should logically be. Not tucked into the lee of the great stone fence his grandfather had built. He was digging in the middle of the small, fallow pasture, a flat, unremarkable piece of land 50 yards from his back door. The decision felt less like a choice and more like a quiet instruction, whispered to him from the brittle, ink-filled pages of his grandfather's journal. The water table is lowest there, the spidery script had read. The ground is clay and stone, 12 feet down. It will hold. He worked with a rhythm that was all his own, a slow, deliberate cadence of plunge, lift, and toss. Each movement was measured, conserving energy for the 1,000 others that would follow. He did not rush. He did not pause to wipe the sweat from his brow, though it beaded on his temples and ran in clean tracks through the dust on his neck. Barrow whined softly, a low note of inquiry. Elias glanced at the dog, a flicker of a smile touching his lips before vanishing. "It's all right, boy," he said, his voice quiet, rough from disuse. "It's just work." By the time the sun dipped below the jagged line of the western ridge, he had excavated a shallow rectangle, 3 feet wide and 7 feet long. It was barely a scratch on the face of the land, a dark wound in the dying grass. He straightened his back, feeling the familiar ache settle deep into his bones. He was 19, but his body felt older, seasoned by labor that had begun when he was a boy. The sound of a wagon creaking down the lane made him turn. Mr. Gable, his closest neighbor, pulled his team to a halt, the horses steaming in the cool air. Gable was a man made of thick, solid shapes, a square jaw, broad shoulders, hands like weathered mallets. He'd farmed this land for 40 years and believed its secrets were his own. He squinted at the hole, then at Elias. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Gable's voice was a gravelly rumble. "Digging your own grave out in the open?" Elias leaned on his shovel. "Root cellar." Gable let out a short, barking laugh. "A root cellar? There? That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. The winter drift will bury that spot 10 feet deep. You'll be digging for your potatoes come May. Why not put it up by the house, where the wind scours the ground clean?" "This is the right place," Elias said. He offered no explanation. He knew it would not be heard. The journal was his, its knowledge a private inheritance. "The right place," Gable scoffed, shaking his head. He flicked the reins. "That's your father's stubbornness talking, not sense. Don't come to me when your door is frozen shut. Wait until the first big snow. You'll see." The wagon creaked onward, leaving Elias alone in the growing twilight with the dog and the hole. Barrow padded over and nudged his hand with a cold, wet nose, as if to say the man was gone. Elias scratched behind his ears, his gaze fixed on the dark rectangle of earth. He saw not a hole, but the beginning of a promise. The next day, he began to dig in earnest. The work was brutal, a relentless assault on the earth. The topsoil gave way to a dense layer of clay that clung to the shovel, heavy and wet. He used a pickaxe to break it apart, the steel head ringing with a dull thud, the vibrations jarring his arms to the shoulder. He filled a wooden wheelbarrow, one shovelful at a time, and hauled the heavy loads to the far edge of the pasture, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Each trip was a small victory, a measured removal of the world above to create a space below. Mrs. Gable came by in the afternoon, carrying a small basket. She was a kind woman, her face a web of worry lines. "Elias, dear," she said, her voice soft with concern. "I brought you some bread and cheese. You can't work like this on an empty stomach." "Thank you, ma'am." He took the offering, his hands caked with dirt. She watched him for a moment, her gaze drifting from his sweat-soaked shirt to the deepening pit. "My husband told me what you're building. He's worried for you. We all are, since, well, a boy alone. This land can be hard. Are you sure about this spot?" "I'm sure," Elias said, his mouth full of bread. "It just seems so exposed," she pressed gently. "The winter winds here, they're not like town winds. They carry teeth." "I have a plan," he said. It was the most he could offer. The plan wasn't just his, it was his grandfather's, drawn in precise, cross-hatched diagrams on yellowed paper. A plan for a cellar unlike any other in the valley. Days turned into a week. The hole grew deeper. He was below his own height now, then deeper still. He built a crude ladder of notched logs to climb in and out. The world became a small patch of sky above and 4 sheer walls of earth around him. Down in the cool darkness, the sounds of the world were muted. The wind a distant whisper, the call of a hawk a faint cry. Barrow would lie at the edge of the pit for hours, his nose twitching, a silent, patient sentinel. The digging changed when he hit the layer of stone his grandfather's journal had predicted. It wasn't bedrock, but a dense stratum of rounded river stones and sharp-edged shale, packed together like teeth in a jaw. The shovel was useless. He worked with a crowbar and a sledgehammer, prying and smashing, his knuckles bleeding from scrapes against the rough walls. Each stone he wrestled free was a battle. He would heave the larger ones, some weighing 50 or 60 pounds, onto a makeshift sled and have Barrow help him drag it up a ramp of planks. The dog would lean into the harness, his muscles straining, a low growl of effort in his chest. One evening, as he was hauling out the last load of stone for the day, another visitor appeared. This was Alderman Thorne, a man whose wealth was evident in the fine cut of his coat and the well-fed gloss of his horse. Thorne owned the mill and held the deeds to half the farms in the county. He looked down into the pit from his saddle, a faint, condescending smile on his face. "Gable told me you were engaged in some novel form of agriculture, young man," Thorne said, his voice smooth and oiled. He was not exaggerating. "What is the purpose of this excavation?" "Cellar," Elias answered, not bothering to look up from coiling his rope. Indeed, an ambitious project for one so young, and in such a peculiar location. My own cellars are dug into hillsides, as is proper. They use the earth itself for support and insulation. This is just a hole, a pit. Wait until the spring thaw. The hydrostatic pressure will collapse these walls like wet paper. "They'll be lined," Elias said quietly. Thorne chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Lined with what? Hope? Listen to your elders, son. Your father was a good man, but he was a traditionalist. He would never have attempted such folly. Fill it in before you hurt yourself. He tapped his riding crop against his boot and rode off without waiting for a reply, leaving the scent of leather and superiority hanging in the air. That night, by the light of a single candle, Elias sat at his small wooden table and opened the journal again. The pages were filled with more than just words. There were drawings of mortise and tenon joints, calculations for load-bearing arches, and notes on air circulation. His grandfather had been a stonemason and a shipwright before he'd ever been a farmer. He understood pressure and stress, the patient strength of stone and the relentless force of water. He had seen how other cellars failed. He had designed one that would not. They build wide and shallow, the journal read. They fight the frost. But the frost always wins. You must go deeper, past the frost line. You must build narrow and deep like a ship's hull. Let the earth press in. A properly built arch turns pressure into strength. Elias traced the drawing of the arch ceiling with a calloused finger. He saw the intricate ventilation shafts, one low for intake of cold, dense air, and one high for the exhaust of warmer, moist air, designed to create a constant, slow current that would keep the cellar dry and the temperature stable. He saw the plans for the door, not one door, but two, separated by a 3-foot airlock, both packed with sawdust and sealed with tarred canvas. And he saw the most unusual feature, a smaller secondary chamber, dug even deeper at the far end, connected by a narrow passage. The cold sump, his grandfather had labeled it. The cold will settle there, like water in a well. The main room will remain above freezing, always. He closed the book. The mockery of Gable and the condescension of Thorne faded into insignificance. They saw a boy digging a hole. He was building a ship to survive an ocean of winter. The first snows came in late November, a light dusting that melted by midday. But it was a warning. The ground grew harder, and the work became a desperate race against the coming freeze. He now focused on lining the walls. He had his pile of excavated stones, and he began hauling more from the creek bed a quarter-mile away, load by painful load in the wheelbarrow. He learned to read the stones, to see how their shapes would fit together. He mixed his own mortar from clay, sand, and ash, a recipe from the journal. It was slow, meticulous work. He laid each stone by hand, fitting it against its neighbors, filling the gaps with mortar. The walls rose inch by inch, a mosaic of gray and brown stone, solid and permanent. He was no longer just digging, he was building. He worked from dawn until his hands were too numb with cold to grip the trowel, and then he worked for another hour by lantern light. His world shrank to the texture of stone, the smell of damp earth, and the burn of his aching muscles. Alara found him there one afternoon, her arms full of blankets she was taking to air out. She was the blacksmith's daughter, with a quiet way about her that Elias had always noticed. She didn't mock or question. She just watched from the fence line, her expression one of genuine curiosity. "That looks like hard work," she said, her voice carrying on the crisp air. Elias looked up from the pit, his face smudged with dirt. He just nodded. "My father says you're using creek stone," she continued, walking closer. "He said it's harder than field stone, denser." "It is," Elias said, surprised. "He respects that," she said. "He says a man who chooses the harder material for a foundation is a man who plans to stay." She lingered for a moment, then added, "Can I bring you some hot cider later? It's a cold day for that kind of work." "I'd like that," he managed to say. She brought the cider that evening, and the next. She would sit with Barrow at the edge of the growing structure, asking quiet questions. Not, why here? But, how do you get them to fit so perfectly? Not, aren't you afraid it will collapse? But what will the roof be made of? She was the only one who asked about the craft of it, who saw the skill and not just the supposed folly. Her presence was a small, steady warmth against the growing cold of the season and the chill of his neighbor's disapproval. He began the roof in early December. This was the most difficult part. He built a temporary wooden framework inside the cellar, a curved skeleton for the arch. Then, using the largest, flattest stones he could find, he began to build inward from the walls, laying the stones against the frame, mortaring them into place. It was perilous work, balancing on the scaffolding, wrestling heavy stones into position above his head. A single mistake could bring the whole thing down. He followed the diagrams in the journal with religious precision, measuring angles, checking levels, tapping each stone into place until it was perfectly seated. The final piece was the keystone, a wedge-shaped block of granite that he had spent 2 days shaping. With Alara and Barrow watching, he hammered it into place with a wooden mallet. There was a deep, resonant thud, and the entire structure seemed to settle, to lock into a state of permanent, unshakable strength. For a long moment, he just laid his hand against it, feeling the immense, compressed power of the arch. It would hold. He removed the wooden frame the next day. The stone arch stood on its own, a perfect, self-supporting curve of gray stone. It was beautiful. Now came the final, most crucial parts. He built the 2 ventilation shafts. Lining them with clay pipes, he fired himself in a makeshift kiln. He dug the cold sump, a 5-foot-deep pit at the back of the cellar, and covered it with a heavy wooden grate. He built the heavy insulated doors, layering thick oak planks with packed sawdust and canvas, and hung them on massive iron hinges Ilara's father had forged for him, the only help he had asked for from the community. The blacksmith had looked at the designs for the hinges, grunted in approval, and charged him a fair price, asking no questions. Finally, he covered the entire stone structure with the earth he had excavated months before. He packed the dirt down, a thick, insulating blanket over 2 feet deep, until the cellar was just a gentle mound in the pasture, with only the 2 small ventilation caps and the angled entryway visible. He sowed the mound with winter rye, the same as the surrounding pasture. By next summer, it would be almost invisible. He finished the day before the first great storm of the season was predicted to arrive. The sky was the color of lead, and the wind had a new, more serious edge to it. He spent the day stocking the cellar, sacks of potatoes and flour, barrels of salted meat, crates of apples, carrots, and onions packed in sand, shelves of preserved fruits and vegetables his mother had put up the year before, firewood, oil for the lamps, blankets, his grandfather's books. He moved his entire existence into the quiet, stable coolness of the earth. The temperature inside was a constant 40 degrees. It was dry and smelled of stone and damp soil. When he closed the inner door, the silence was absolute. Barrow curled up on a pile of sacks, sighed, and went to sleep. Elias sat at the small table he'd built, ran a hand over the smooth stone wall, and felt a profound sense of peace. He was ready. The storm arrived not as a flurry, but as a wall. The wind came first, a low moan that rose to a piercing shriek. Then the snow began, thick and heavy, driven almost horizontally by the gale. It was not a normal snow. It was a blizzard of a ferocity no one in the valley could remember. Within hours, the world outside the cellar vanished into a churning vortex of white. The small window in the outer door was completely covered. The wind hammered at the thick wood, but inside there was only a distant, muffled roar. The air was still and calm. The lantern cast a steady golden glow on the stone walls. Elias cooked a stew on a small iron stove, the pipe venting through a clever chimney system his grandfather had designed. The smell of beef and onions filled the small space. He and Barrow ate in comfortable silence, the storm a forgotten beast raging somewhere far above them. He slept soundly that night, buried deep in the quiet heart of the earth, warm and safe. He stayed in the cellar for 2 days. He read his grandfather's books, mended a harness, and methodically checked his supplies. The temperature never wavered. The air remained fresh. The design was perfect. On the 3rd morning, the wind had died down. The silence that replaced it was heavy, profound. He pushed open the inner door and stepped into the airlock. The outer door was crusted with a thick layer of ice. He had to use a small pry bar to break the seal. When he finally forced it open, he was met with a solid wall of snow. It was packed hard as rock. Mr. Gable's prediction had come true. His door was buried. But Elias had planned for this. He took up the shovel he'd stored in the airlock and began to dig. It wasn't a frantic digging, but the same steady, rhythmic work he'd used to build the cellar. He was digging a tunnel, not straight out, but up, at a 45-degree angle. The journal had been clear. The drift will be deep, but the slope of the entry will be its own roof. You don't dig out, you dig up. After an hour of work, the shovel broke through into open air. A brilliant, painful blue sky greeted him. He widened the hole and pulled himself out. The sight that met him stole his breath. The world was gone. Everything. Fences, shrubs, wagons, even the lower branches of the trees, was buried beneath a seamless blanket of white. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, sculpted by the wind into waves and cliffs. Some were 20 feet high. His own small house was barely visible, just the peak of its roof and the top of its chimney sticking out of a mountain of snow. The valley was silent, still, and utterly transformed. It was beautiful and terrifying. He was standing on the surface of a new world, the entrance to his tunnel a dark hole in the otherwise perfect white. Barrow scrambled out after him, blinking in the bright sun, and began to bound through the deep powder with joyful abandon. Then a sound, a desperate muffled shouting. He scanned the landscape and saw it, a hand waving from the 2nd-story window of the Gables farmhouse. He could see Mr. Gable's face pressed against the glass. Their house, on lower ground than his, was almost completely entombed. It took him nearly 2 hours to traverse the 50 yards to their home. He had to use his shovel to carve a trench through the massive drift that had swallowed their porch and front door. He finally reached the side of the house and smashed a 1st-floor window with the back of his shovel. He cleared the glass and snow and climbed inside. The Gables were huddled in the kitchen, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The fire was out. Their woodpile was buried outside. The room was brutally cold. Mr. Gable looked at him, his face pale, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a raw, hollowed-out fear. Mrs. Gable was crying softly. "The roof is making noises," Gable said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The weight. I think it's going to go. Our cellar flooded. The snowmelt must have found a way in. Everything's ruined." "Come with me," Elias said. It was not a request. He led them back through the trench he had dug. When they reached the mound of his cellar and the dark hole of his tunnel, Gable stopped. He stared at it, then at Elias, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "My God, boy," he breathed. "It's clear. The wind, it went right over the top of you." The smooth, aerodynamic shape of the mound had offered no resistance for the wind to build a drift against. The snow had simply scoured over it, leaving only a few feet of powder on top. Elias led them down into the warmth and light of the cellar. Mrs. Gable gasped when she saw the neat shelves, the glowing lantern, the pot of stew still simmering on the stove. She touched a stone wall, as if to confirm it was real. It's warm," she whispered. Gable walked the length of the cellar, his boots silent on the packed earth floor. He peered down into the cold sump. He held his hand up to the ventilation shaft, feeling the faint, cool draft. He looked at the perfect arch of the ceiling. He saw not a hole, but a masterpiece of engineering. He turned to Elias, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, an arrogant old fool." Elias just nodded and ladled out 3 bowls of hot stew. They were not the last to arrive. Later that day, he saw a small group of people struggling across the snowfields from the direction of the village. It was Alderman Thorne, his fine coat torn and his face gaunt, leading a small party of families, including Alara and her father. Their own homes were either buried or their roofs had collapsed under the immense weight of the snow. They had seen the smoke from Elias's stovepipe, the only sign of life in the entire valley. Thorne did not offer an apology in words. His was in his humbled posture, in the way he accepted a blanket and a piece of bread without comment, his eyes full of a respect that bordered on awe. He sat on a crate, shivering, and looked around the shelter that was saving his life, a shelter he had dismissed as a boy's folly. For the next week, the cellar was a sanctuary. 17 people lived in the space designed for one. They shared the food, the warmth, the safety. Elias was no longer the strange, solitary boy. He was their anchor. They listened when he spoke, his short, declarative sentences now carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. He showed them how the ventilation worked, how the sump kept the dampness at bay. He explained the principle of the arch, the way the pressure of the earth made it stronger. He was not teaching, he was simply sharing what he knew. Alara stayed close to his side, her presence a quiet support. She helped him organize the supplies, tend to the others, and keep the small space orderly. In her eyes, he saw the same steady belief that had been there from the start, now deepened into something more. When the thaw finally came, and the people could return to their ruined homes, things had changed. The valley was not the same, and neither was Elias's place in it. Alderman Thorne, true to the change Elias had seen in his eyes, came to him with a proposal. He offered to pay for the materials and labor for any family in the valley who wanted to build a cellar like Elias's. He asked Elias to supervise the work. "This knowledge," Thorne said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, "it shouldn't belong to just one man. It belongs to this community. You've shown us that." So, Elias, with the journal in his hands, began to teach. He didn't stand before them and lecture. He went out into their fields with them, showed them how to read the land, how to find the right place to dig. He worked alongside them, his shovel next to theirs, showing them how to lay the stones, how to build the arch. He shared his grandfather's wisdom freely, and in doing so, He wove himself into the fabric of the community that had once held him at arm's length. They no longer called him the stubborn boy. They called him Elias, the Cellarite. The cellars they built, deep and strong and arched, became known as Elias Cellars. They were monuments to a wisdom that had been scorned and then, through trial by ice and snow, had been proven true. Years passed. The scars of the great blizzard faded from the landscape, but not from the memory of the people. The valley was now protected by a network of 24 deep cellars, each a bastion of safety and a testament to the quiet boy who had followed an old book. Elias married Ilara in the spring, in a meadow vibrant with new life. They built their life in the small house, and their children grew up playing on the gentle green mound in the pasture, the entrance to the cellar their favorite place to hide. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his amber eyes clouded over, and his steps became slow and careful. He spent most of his days sleeping by the fire or lying in the sun at the cellar's entrance, his post even in old age. One cool autumn evening, 17 years after the great storm, Barrow laid his head on Elias's lap as they sat by the fire, gave a soft sigh, and did not wake up. Elias carried his old friend, his first and most faithful believer, outside and buried him under the tall oak tree that overlooked the cellar. He carved a simple stone for him. Barrow. He knew. Elias himself grew old. His dark hair turned the color of winter frost, and his hands, though still strong, were gnarled with arthritis. He became the quiet elder of the valley, a man of few words but immense presence. He didn't tell stories of the great blizzard. He didn't need to. The cellars told the story for him. He still maintained the original cellar, the stone walls now covered in soft green moss, the air inside smelling of earth, apples, and thyme. He would sit down there in the quiet coolness, his hand on the stone, and feel the presence of his grandfather, of Barrow, of a lifetime of quiet, steady work. He lived to see his grandchildren learn the art of stone and earth from him. His grandfather's journal now passed to a new generation. When he died, peacefully in his 87th year, the entire valley came to lay him to rest. They buried him next to Barrow, under the same oak tree, his grave overlooking the gentle mound that had saved them all. Alderman Thorne's grandson, a man humbled by the stories of his grandfather's folly, commissioned a stone carver from the city. They worked for a week, and when they were done, the stone they placed at the head of the grave was simple, elegant, and true. It did not list his accomplishments or his titles. It had only his name, the dates of his life, and 3 words carved below them. Elias, 1874 to 1961. He built a safe place. The seasons turned. The valley thrived. Children who had never known the great blizzard were born and grew old. But they all knew the story. And on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howled and the snow piled in deep, silent drifts, the people of the valley would go to their cellars, their safe places, and feel a quiet gratitude for the stubborn boy who listened to the wisdom of the earth and who proved, with nothing more than a shovel, a dog, and a book, that the deepest strength is often the most quiet. The mound in the pasture remained, a gentle rise in the land, a green and living monument, its heavy oak door waiting, always ready. It would hold.